Everybody mute themselves.
Okay. Kum lernen a block Gemara, Mitzvah Shabbos Shuvah, Tavshin Pei Beis. We are up to Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph on the very top. And we were just this entire parak. The Masechta Beya is all about Yom Tov, and it's actually quite a difficult Masechta. And the first parak of Masechta Beya deals basically with a number of arguments between Shammai and Hillel, or Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So the last thing we learned about was how you have to prepare the birds that you want to use for Yom Tov. And the question is, if you prepared some and others are paired, can we assume it's the same ones or different ones? And then we had one case that you prepared one inside the nest over there in the chicken coop, and but then you found it outside of the chicken coop, not inside the chicken coop. We say that it's usher because we're going to assume that the birds that were in the chicken coop flew away, and these are birds from abroad that came by. Now, we already raised before a Gemara in Baba Basra where Rabbi Chanina discusses we generally follow the rules of probability, which is Raiv. But if you have two conflicting rules, one is the rule of proximity, which is called Karev, and one is the rule of probability, which is Raiv, which is overrides the other, and he says it's Raiv. And the Gemara has a discussion over there. So why don't we use this din right here? Because we said the birds, even though it's in front of the nest, obviously it's in close proximity to the nest, but we're going to assume it came from the majority of birds out there in the wild. So we see that Reiv overrides. Says the Gemara. You designated those inside the nest. Can you found them in front of the nest? As soon as forbidden. Why isn't this a support, a corroborating proof? Because the Amar of Chanina said, Raiv, the Karev, if you have the rule of probability and the rule of proximity, Halech achar Raiv, that Raiv is more powerful. Same thing here. Amar Abaye says, we don't bring a proof from here. You know why? Because we can learn, we're talking about daf. Just like you see on the telephone wires, birds sit there and they just, sit there and they rest. Same thing over here. There was a board, a plank, right in front of the nest. And the numerous birds from abroad that are sitting on the plank. So therefore, it's not just a question of probability. The proximity of the birds from the wild are just as strong as the proximity of the nest itself. And therefore, we'll follow the Raiv in this case. So there's no proof from here. Rava says, we're talking about an interesting case. We're talking about two nests. So these two holes, one above the other, skinning. And what happened was you set aside, designated one of them, and then when you came back, there were birds in the other one. There's no longer any birds, and the one that you designated is no longer there, and they're standing outside in front of the one of the other one. Do we assume that your birds are gone and these are other ones and you didn't designate them, or do we say the other ones have gone and these are your birds that are there now? So that's what the Mishnah is talking about. So and when we're talking about small birds that can't really fly. So you don't have to say zimin betachtoina if you organize for the bottom nest. You didn't organize the top one. And you didn't find any birds in the bottom one, but you only you found them on the bottom one. You found the birds on the bottom one, but you didn't find them at all in the top one. So you found them on the bottom one in front of the nest, and you found nothing in the top one that you originally designated. So therefore, the Asidim will say definitely that these birds are not the birds that you designated. I mean, we'll say Hanach Azul Almu. We're going to say that the birds on the bottom that you designated are gone. Hanach Haraya, they're not inside the nest anymore. Hanach Ishtarbu. These are the birds from above that just jumped down. The Nachas, and they went down, and there they are. So in other words, we have no proof that these are the original birds because they're no longer inside the cavity there, they're outside, in front of the nest. Elafilu zimin belyona, even if you designated the top one, you didn't designate the bottom one. And now you found the birds on top in front of the nest. Now, generally, these birds don't really fly, they're small. So we have an inkling here that the birds in front of the nest are probably from the nest itself because the birds below can't really fly up. You didn't find any bird below. Is Hanach Name Asidi. We still can say you cannot assume automatically that the birds on top in front of the nest are the birds from inside the nest. Because it's quite likely, or it's just as possible that we say Hanach Azulam, the original birds that you designate on top are gone. The Hanach Sruchi Sadixly, they just walked up slowly and there they are, and they're up, went on top. So in other words, there's no roiv and karav here. They're both karavs. There's no roiv here. There's one at the bottom, one on top. There's no roiv here. We're not talking about birds from the wild. We're talking about two nests, one on top of the other, and one of them is gone now, and the other one is not inside the nest anymore. It's in front, and the question is which one it is. We don't know, and we're going to be machmir, and we are going to ask it. Says the Mishnah further, V'im ein sham elahein hare'elu mutar. But if these are the only ones that are there, these are the only ones. Yesterday, when you were there, there were only two birds, and that's it, only these, then they're permitted. Why? Because and then you come the next day on Yom Tov, you say, all you see is two birds there, then you assume that these are the same two birds that you originally designated. There were no birds yesterday, nor the birds here today. So the obvious question is, hey Chidami, what are we talking about? Why are you so convinced that definitely these are the two original birds? Because they're not inside the nest. Remember, the inside the nest doesn't talk about. The inside the cavity doesn't talk about. We're talking about they're in front. Older birds that can fly around, then how do you know the originals? It's just as possible to say, the original ones that you designated are gone. They flew away. These are other birds. We're talking about small little birds that can't really fly far. They just, they walk. So if there's another nest within 50 amma, we say that birds that can only walk, can't really fly, they can travel up to 50 ammas. And if you remember the Gemara Babasi, you learn, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the famous question, so what happens if one leg is within the 50 ammas and the other leg is outside the 50 ammas? Is that considered a neighbor, within the distance? Is that considered proximity or not? And that's when they threw him out of yeshiva. Remember, he's the one who always asks these kind of questions. But sorry?
Why did I check him out? It's a Gemara.
Some people ask questions and nitpick so much that the teachers just couldn't tolerate it anymore.
You mean like me?
I didn't say that.
Something like that.
But they eventually let it back in. They let him back in. You'll see throughout Shas, he always asks these kind of interesting questions. He's very pedantic and very particular. He nitpicks. That's what he is. He's a nitpicker.
We used to call the Klotzka.
No, this is more than a kluskash. It's a nitpicker. It means whatever you say, he always finds something to ask. Like a nitpicker. I'm sure you met these kind of kids or students somewhere. But is since if it's tomorrow, ask a question. If there's another nest within 50 ammas, then they're both proximity. How do you know these are the original birds? Maybe these are the other birds that just marched over. And the leka came, but there's no other birds around. There's no other nest around. You need the mission to tell me that this must be these two birds, the same ones. They have nowhere to go. There's small little birds, and there's still there. There's no other birds there present yesterday, no other birds present today, even though they're not inside the nest, they're outside. Surely that's where they come from. Pshita de mutarim. Surely it's obvious that they're permitted. Maruka Bachama said, that any bird that walks around, they don't walk more than 50 ammas. That's the distance that they travel. So what's the Chiddush in our Mishnah? What exactly is the scenario here? Says the Gemara, I will tell you the Ika came with 50 amma. We're talking about there's a nest within 50 amma. No, so how do we know the birds that you found there in front of the nest are from the nest itself? Maybe they're from the other nest that's within 50 amma. They're both considered in close proximity. We're talking about the Mishnah is talking about a case going to Kaima. We are talking about the Keren Zavis, that there's a corner of the house that's protruding, and therefore that other nest that's within 50 ammas cannot really see this nest because the house is butting out and it's blocking the view. And little birds, even though they might walk away from the nest up to 50 ammas, always want to see the original nest. They want to have a line of sight. And if there's no line of sight, they're not secure enough to go over there. They don't know what's over there. I would have thought, that's a Chiddush mission. I would have thought, well, there's two nests close proximity. Perhaps it's from the other nest 50 ammas away or 49 ammas away. You didn't designate it, don't use it. Whenever they walk, if they can see their original nest, they will walk. If it's within line of sight. But if it's not within line of sight, they won't walk, and therefore you can rest assured that these birds that you're seeing here are the same birds that you designated yesterday. Continuing on with the Mishnah. In the laws of Muktzah, we have different grades of Muktzah. And one of the most common one is called a Kli Shemalachta Li'isa, a tool which primarily is used for a malacha which is prohibited on Shabbos. For example, the typical example is a hammer. A hammer is meant to use to knock in nails to build. You cannot build on Shabbos, so that hammer is muktzah. And it's known as a kli, it's a utensil or a tool, shemalachta le'isr. A tool shemalachta le'isr has two exceptions when you're allowed to move them on Shabbos. And once you can move them, you can put them wherever you want. One is called the tzayda gufay, and one is the tzayda mekayim. The tzayda mekayim means it's sitting on the table and you can't put any food there. So you're allowed to pick it up, remove it, because you need that space. And you can put it, once you have it in your hand, you can place it wherever you want. The tzayda gufay means you want to use the hammer itself, but for a permitted use. For example, the Gemara talks about a paperweight. If the wind is blowing, you put it on the napkins, on the serviettes, you don't want it to blow away. So those are the two exceptions that you're allowed to. But if it's not a kli shemalachti, so like rocks and dirt, then it's muktzah machmas atzmai. It itself is muktzah. It's not a keli. Then even if you need the space, you cannot move it. Even if you need it in a permitted use, you cannot move it. Then you have a muktzah machmas chesaron kis, something which is very expensive, like the knife of a diamond cutter, which is very, very expensive knife, a specialized tool. That even those Tanoim who don't agree with the laws of muktzah concede that a muktzah machmas chesaron kis, something that you're going to completely remove from your mind. You have no interest at all using on Shabbos, and that's awesome. And you have many other kinds of muktzah, muktzah machamitzah, muktzah machisa, muktzah machamias, and so on. So we're going to talk about an eli is a tool that what do you call it? It's a tool that they use to it's a very, very heavy piece of wood, and it's used basically to crush. And but now you want to use it as a flat board to cut meat on it. So you want to use it for permitted use. So Bishama says eli, you cannot take this eli lekatzav alabasa and use it for permitted use. Why not? So Rashi holds that Beishamai holds, even though it's a klisha malachta li'isr, and the general rule is that you're allowed to. We hold that a klisha malachta li'isr, if you want to use it for permitted use, that's all right. Beishamai doesn't agree with that principle. He holds if it's a klisha malachta li'isr, it is muktzah, and under no circumstance can you use it. That's how.
What is Shabbos candles?
That's worse. That's muktzah machmas isr. That is the reason why it's muktzah is because right now you're not allowed to move the candle while it's burning because you might extinguish it. And that's different. That's stricter. Even after the fire burns out, you cannot move it, even though you need the space. You can't do that. That's why they used to have a Shabbos goy to remove the candles from the table. It didn't help that you need a space on the table. You want to change the tablecloth because it's a much stricter kind of muktzah. And
Unless you put it on a tray with a challah or something.
Doesn't help. Because the tray is a designated tray for the leichter. So it doesn't help putting a challah. For your tablecloth, it helps putting a challah there, because the tablecloth is to put things on there, and you can put there something else besides. No, on your tablecloth, besides the candles or muktzah, you have a challah on there, or wine, or something that a mitzvah, it becomes a basis for mutter and us, but not when it comes to a tray for a candle. Because the trays, unless you have a big plate and you just put the candle on the plate. So the plate is not specifically made for the candle, then you can argue that you put a challah there, because remember, we don't look at the silver leichter for value, we look at the fire itself, and fire doesn't have much value. So as long as you have something else there that you need for Shabbos, like challah or something, you could. But who does that? Tracer disagrees with Rashi. Sorry?
So it depends on the buses, if it's generally used for candles or just used for other stuff as well.
Exactly. So that's the difference in a tablecloth, let's say, versus a candle tray. When you buy a candelabra and you buy your Shabbos lichter, you buy your leichter, you buy a tray, usually the tray suits the leichter. That's what it's there for. Okay. Taisa disagree. Taisa hold that even Shammai would agree that a klisha malachta liser, if you want to use a permitted use, you can. Here it's muktzah machmas chesaron kis. It seems that this is a very expensive item, and therefore it's totally muktzah. Anyway, Beishamai disallows it, and Beis Hillel matir. Beis Hillel says that using it for permitted use, no problem. The next part that we already had before is what Bishamay says, Ein noisin esa oil. If you shecht an animal on Yom Tov and now you're stripping the hide, and the hide, you usually put it on you have to trample on it. If you want to tan the hide, you want to use the hide, you have to trample on it, thin it out. So Ein noisin esa oil lifnei hadosim. Bishamay says you cannot place it on the ground, so people should trample on it and start the trampling process. Nor v'loyak bienu. Don't lift it up and you want to hang it on a peg or something else so that it should start airing out. You can't do that either. If there's meat attached to the hide, then you can, because we're going to say that the hide is secondary to the meat. Beis Hillel says you can do either one. You can use it to trample. Because why? Because Beis Hillel is very concerned about Simchas Yom Tov, as we discussed before. Beis Hillel, we said maybe because of Simchas Yom Tov, but Beis Hillel is very concerned about Simchas Yom Tov. If we're not going to allow it, we're going to cause him a loss on his hide. He's then not going to shecht an animal. But we gave another reason possibly is because people used to put a hide on the ground and they used to sit on it or put food on it so it can be used as a tablecloth. That's why you're allowed to put it on the ground, let people walk on it. Tell the Gemara. Tana, we learned Vishavin, but they all agree. Once you already, let's say, cut on this board, now it's over. Then you're not allowed to move anymore. Even according to Hillel, you're no longer any use for Yom Tov, so you're not allowed to move it anymore. Machlekes is regarding this particular mortar. But if let's say you have a board which called the bone breaker, they used to use it to used to break the bones on top of this board. Then divrei hakol mutter, because it's really it's something which malachte. The way Rashi learns is some others learn differently. It's a malachte leheter. There's nothing. What you're doing now, there's nothing wrong with it. You're allowed to cut meat. You're allowed to cut bones on Yom Tov. So therefore, if it's malachte leheter, surely you're allowed to use it. Says the Gemara. Pshita. What's the chiddush? Ali Tanan. Why not? It says clearly in the Mishnah, the only thing you're not allowed to use is an oli, but you're allowed to use a board to break bones and so on. No, I would have thought, I would have thought that even this board that you break the bones on, you shouldn't use on Yom Tov either. The Heidik Tani Oli, why is it Oli Lahaidiacha to teach you Koichen de Beis, to show you how far Beis Hillel goes. That board which breaks bones, there's nothing isa there. But even if you have this board that you use it to crush things, which you're not allowed to do. It's to crush wheat. They should crush wheat in half or in 3 parts, which you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov and Shabbos. So even something to Malach Delisa, Namishari is also permitted. Maybe the purpose of the mission is to tell you how far Hillel is permitting. We're not out to tell you how far Shammai is prohibiting. Kamash will tell you that in this case, even Shammai would agree it's all right because it's not a Malach Delisa, it's a Malach Delahet.
It's a Yom Tov and Shabbos. For both, Yom Tov too.
We're talking about Yom Tov right now. There's no problem at all Yom Tov because it's a malachte lehet. Or it's a cutting board, but it's a strong one. You can break bones on it, and you're allowed to go ahead and cut meat on it on Yom Tov. No problem.
In other forms of muktzah, not shemalach delisa, for example, like machmat gufo, for example, a rock. You use it for a permitted thing. Like, for example, if you have a rock that's sitting in your garden and on Yom Tov you want to hold the gate open with a rock, can you move? Then that's
no.
You can't do that
unless you designate it before Yom Tov. That's what they say in Bnei Brak when they should throw the stones on the cars. They had a pile before Yom Tov or Shabbos to make sure it's not muktzah. So the only way you can use a rock, you have to designate it before Shabbos and Yom Tov that this is going to be your door stopper. Let's say. So then you're allowed to. Otherwise, then you can't. Now, what's the chiddush? If it's just a cutting board, what's the big deal? The chiddush according to Shammai, that Shammai, you might say that this cutting board, because we just said a minute ago, once you use it for whatever purpose you use it, you're not allowed to use it for other. You're not allowed to just move it around because it's a tircha that's unnecessary. So we're scared that what happens. Shammai will say, what happens? You bring this board over here, and then you change your mind. You're not going to use it. So you just did a tircha, a bother for no purpose. And Shammai is worried. We'll soon see the Gemara about changing your mind. The chiddush is we're not worried. Ikidam is another version of the same thing, but instead of somebody asking a question on Abaye, it was a rhetorical question, and he answered himself. Abaye said, even a brand new board over here, you're allowed to use. And he adds the word brand new. And what's the chiddush? I would have thought, that according to Shammai, it's a brand new board, you didn't use it. Maybe you'll bring it there, it's a tircha, and then you'll change your mind. Kamash, well, we're not worried you will change your mind. Says the Gemara, if that's what the Chiddush is, it does worry occasionally that you might change your mind. So why are you permitted to use this cutting board? If you never used it before and you're bringing it over and there's a bother involved there, how do you know you won't change his mind? Where do you see that Shammai holds you can change your mind? Says the Gemara, Beishamai lechaysh the word change your mind, but Tanya we learned, Beishamai emrim, ein melichin, you do not bring tabach v'sakin eitzel behema. You don't bring all the tools on the butcher to the animal. V'lei behema eitzel, if they're far away. Or bring it to the butcher. Why not? Because we're scared. You can bring it all the way there. So it's a big tircha. And then you're going to change your mind. You decide, you know what, I'm not going to go ahead with that animal. Or Beis Hill says, no problem. You're allowed to bring it, no problem. We're not concerned. We're not worried you're going to change your mind. If you're already going, you're probably going to proceed with it. So we see Beishamai is concerned till the very last minute, you might change your mind. And he proscribes it on Yom Tov. So why does he allow you to use that brand new cutting board? Beishamai says, you don't bring the spices and everything else to where the mortar and pestle is, or the vice versa, because you might change your mind. And Beis Hillel says, you can't bring it to each other. No, so we see Shammai is always worried it'll change your mind. So why are you allowed to bring the cutting board? So you want to hachi hashta. What are you comparing? When it comes to an animal, you shouldn't bring it across. You might change your mind because you have good reason to change your mind. You're right. I do want to shecht an animal, but I have good reason. You know why? The Amad, you might say, this animal looks a bit lean. I remember now I have a better animal that has more substance, more flesh. I still want to proceed with the shchita, but I'll bring another animal which is better. Or kedei nami. Or let's say when it comes to the food, you want to bring these spices over, or you want to bring the pestle and mortar to the spices, you might change your mind and say, look, I'm not in the mood of spices now. No, I'm going to change the menu. I know I'm having a guest that hates hot chilies. So forget that. I'm not going to use this particular food that requires these spices. I'll bring another food. It doesn't require spices. Rasha, for example, cabbage or turnip. They don't require all kinds of seasoning. Just a little bit of salt and that's it. So there's a good, in other words, you're not changing your mind dramatically. You're still going to go ahead. You're going to cook something, but you know what? I'm going to change the menu. Over here, you're taking the animal, over here, in the case of the cutting board, you need to cut the animal. You shecht an animal, you need to cut the animal. What are we scared of? What are you going to change your mind? He's going to change his mind, now break it. Once you shecht an animal, you need to break down the meat. That's what you're meant to do with the animal. There's no prospect that he's going to change his mind. Anyway, Beishamai says, you don't give the hide. You don't give the hide and place it in front of the people who trample on it. Says the Gemara, V'tana, we learned, V'shavin, but we did learn that part of the process of tanning is, you put salt. That's why on Shabbos you have all of these tool lists. You're not allowed to put salt on cucumbers, for example, a long time before your meal, because it starts then salt. It starts you see, it starts bubbling away and it starts marinating. And you're not allowed to marinate the Shabbos, which comes from this malacha. It's called ibud. You're not allowed to tan, because when you put the salt, you put a lot of salt on the hide, it starts going through, it starts taking out all the dirt and starts softening up the hide. But they all agree, shemolchin ala basar letzili. You're allowed to put a little bit of salt, like you would put for a roast. When you roast meat, you don't have to salt, even though the din is you have to salt meat within 3 days. But if you roast it, you don't have to salt at all, because the roasting on the fire sucks out all the blood. But you still put a modicum of salt for taste. If you put that kind of salt on the hide, it doesn't bother us, because it's not enough really to begin its function on the hide. Talking about only put a modicum of salt, which you normally use when you grill something. When you cook something, they used to put a lot more salt in, then that's forbidden, because you put it on the hide, you're already starting your tanning process. Says the Gemara Pshita. What are you trying to tell us? Let's sleep on. It says clearly you're allowed to put salt that you normally use for a roast. How come the Bible wants to say that data, that even if you're putting it for a roast, but you put a bit more than what you normally put for a roast, you're putting in the roast, let's say what you would put for cooking, also it is forbidden. So in other words, so more than you normally put for roasting, but it's more similar cooking, that's forbidden as well.
Does that relate to laying down a skin on the ground?
Yeah, we're talking about, they used to put the trampling as part of the process. They trample it, salting, it's all part of the tanning process.
That's the Zelda.
It's the same idea. So we're saying you're putting a little bit of salt is not a problem. It's only a lot of salt. Because you would think we shouldn't allow any salt on it. So we're telling you we're not going to be geyser. You can put a little bit of salt like you normally put for a roast, but not more. Then we continue. Talking about we learned. You're not allowed to salt the fats. Remember fats, if it, you don't have fridges in those days, how do they preserve all the meat and everything else? They would salt it heavily, and that's how they preserved it. But so if you want to put salt on the fat so that it shouldn't go foul, even though you shecht on Yom Tov, you're allowed to, you're not allowed to put salt because you're preserving it for after Yom Tov. And obviously you're not allowed to do that. Plus you're preserving, which is not from the thing you're allowed to do. So a molchin is a chalav, you're not allowed to salt the fats, but ein mahapchin behen, nor can you turn them over and in order that it should air out. Because again, it's part of the process of preserving. If you says you're allowed to actually place them on pegs and the air will air it out. He says you're allowed to. Amar Ramasna says Ramasna, because you're not doing anything, you just put it on pegs and the air is doing whatever it has to do. Amar Ramasna halacha kirabi shulach. You can do that. Says the Gemara. Others say Amar Ramasna ain't halacha kirabi shulach. Is not like Rabbi Shua. Says the Gemara. I don't understand. The one who tells me halacha is like Rabbi Shua. I need you to say that. Sal kedat. I would have thought it's the rabbis versus Rabbi Shua. We have a general rule. Yachid v'rabim halacha kirabi. Whenever there's a majority, there's a number of people arguing with a single person. We always follow the rabbi. The kamashla yachid. And yet you want to tell us that Allah is like Rabbi Yeshua? I understand. But the one who says that Allah is not like Rabbi Yeshua, Pshita, obviously Allah is not like him. Because we have the rule, Yachid v'Rabim, halacha k'Rabim. So what are you telling us? Says no. I would have thought that even though Rabbi Yeshua is a lone opinion, Mistaber time with Rabbi Yeshua's reason makes sense. Because the Eloi Shadisle, why does his reason make sense? Because the Eloi Shadisle, because if you're not going to allow him to somehow or another save his fats, he won't shecht his animals because he'll incur a big loss. So he won't have meat on Yom Tov, and we are going to prevent him enjoying the Yom Tov. We're scared that this is going to prevent him from shechting, and he'll lack a single Yom Tov. That's why he comes to tell you that even though it makes sense what Rabbi Shua says, we are not going to allow you to do that. Says the Gemara, so I don't understand. You're not going to allow him to air out the fats, and yet, and why do we allow him then to place the hide on the ground? Because we don't want him to incur a loss. Because if he incurs a loss, he won't shech next time. So what's the difference? The fats or the hide? Fats, we don't allow him to do anything to save it, and yet the hide we do. So very simply, there's a problem of marasayin. Also, when it comes to the hide, it's not that obvious that he's trying to save the hide. What do? He put it on the ground, people walking over it. People use it as a tabletop. They sit on it and they put their food there. So therefore, it doesn't look like you're tanning. Here, people are going to say, what's going on here? And what's the problem? My time is the Rabbanon allowed them to place the fats on pegs, right? In order to preserve the fats, and they shouldn't go foul. So the average person says, so there's different ways of preserving the fats. One is to put it on pegs so that it airs out. The other one is to salt it. And they'll say, well, if you're allowed to preserve the fats, mali lemishtachinu, what's the difference if you just spread it on the ground? Mali lemamlechinu. Why can't I just salt it? Therefore, mistakes can arise from that, and that's why we don't allow you to preserve the fats. But when it comes to the hide, we're not worried, because people already assume what he's doing is he's just having a table.
In those days, anyone was allowed to shecht also.
Anyone? No, we're going to learn a chulin that the mission starts off hakel sheichtin, but we'll see remember the Gemara chulin that you have to be a mumche, all kinds of rules.
Yeah, but in these circumstances, we're talking about home. We're talking about batim who could.
Yeah, but we learned before that you're allowed to bring it to a tabach, you bring it to a sheikhet, to a butcher. So either you have a neighbor.
I wouldn't talk, for example, with chickens. They're talking about the people doing their own shechita.
No, they wouldn't do themselves. There were people who knew, a lot of people who knew how to shecht, but they would bring it to them. But not that maybe they themselves know how to shecht as well, or they went to the local sheikhet. I'm going to teach you a trick, he says. On Yom Tov, if you only need one piece, you're allowed to go ahead and salt as many pieces as you want. We'll allow you to salt because you need it for Yom Tov, as many as you want, even though you don't need more than one. And the same thing by cooking on Yom Tov. We allow you to cook a lot more than what you need for the meal. Once you're allowed to cook, you can add whatever you want. All you need is one piece. Rav Ada bar Ava, Marim used to trick. He would salt one piece at a time. He salted a piece of meat, then he said, I don't like this piece, let me try another one. And they continued doing this all the time. Machlekes Rishonim, if everybody can do this, or only a Talmid Chacham who knows what they're doing. And Tosfos says over here that people used to use this trick to shecht more than one chicken. So they would shecht one chicken and then eat a sliver of the liver of the chicken and say, I don't like it, I'll shecht another chicken. So even though you don't need more than one chicken for the meal, there's a way of getting around it. And but you should do that before you eat the meal, so it still sounds reasonable. After you eat the meal, then it looks very clear that you're just preparing for after Yom Tov.
Why don't they rely on Shmuel just to say, well, maybe guess for Kam, I'll shech the whole a few chunks. So
you mean Rabbah? Rabbah Chizda we had him Psach, that you say the hoil the mikla orchim. That's regarding cooking and everything else.
Yeah, but I mean, Shmuel just said here, Moilech Adam Kamachatichas.
Yeah, there's no trick. Shmuel is saying once we allow you to do, since it's one, no, but you can, if you have one piece of meat there, you have 10 pieces of meat right next to you. He's not saying one after another. That he doesn't allow. He's saying vas achas. So you have 10 pieces of meat lying on the table together, and the same, it's basically the same bother to whether you sold one meat or 10 meats. So you might as well do 10. But Rav Ad was saying something else. You can do one at a time. One at a time. And each time you do one, they say, I don't like this meat. I'll take another one. And so on and so forth. And that's how you can go through all of them, which is the bigger chiddush. Mishnah. Beishamai says, we already had it before as well, Ein misalkin es atreisin b'yomtiv. Beishamai says, if you have these, they used to have these cabinets, and they used to have these doors. And all the stores, it's clear from here, they used to have the stores that sell food open on Yom Tov, which is pretty interesting. People would go in, you're not allowed to talk price, and people would go in and they would buy whatever merchandise they needed for Yom Tov and not talk about price. And after Yom Tov, they would organize a price, like going now to a restaurant on Shabbos or on Yom Tov and whatever it is, but you don't talk price. And after Yom Tov, or prior, you paid for it and everything as well. But even after Yom Tov, you go in and you pay. You took some more drinks than you ever asked after Yom Tov. And during Yom Tov, you don't talk about price. And we'll call this, as we said in the Gemara before, this is called Simchas Yom Tov. We're going to allow this so people should be able, otherwise they won't open the stores. Because they didn't have refrigerators in those days. They couldn't buy a week's supply to last. So they had to basically buy every day fresh. And that's why they allowed the stores to be open. And it was necessary. So Beishamai says, so they used to have these cabinets and they used to store all their things there. And then it was like in the airport, you see, they have some of these things that they have all their food inside these boxes or these cabinets. And then they would open up, they would take off the doors and the doors become the table, the trestle table that holds everything up. And they would put all the spices there and everything else display. So Beishamai says, a misalkin is atreisin b'yom tov. You're not allowed to remove these doors on Yom Tov, as we'll see tomorrow later. Why not? And Beis Hillel says, matirin, not only can you remove these doors, but also lahachsa, you can return them as well. Says, first of all, my trace, what is this trace? What are these doors? Amar Rasul says, trace chanuyas. These are the doors of these stores I just told you before, these cabinets, and they would sit there in the street, and then they're portable. And the idea is very important that they're portable, as we're going to see, that there's no building, there's no construction and destruction when it comes to portable items. Ula said, that three things, the hatiru seifim, we allowed them to do things which are not necessary for Yom Tov. For example, here, Beis Hillel says you can return that door to the cabinet. Returning the door to the cabinet does not benefit Yom Tov, but we allow him because otherwise they won't set up in the first instance, and we want these stores open on Yom Tov. So therefore, three things we matter seif in the end, even though it doesn't benefit Yom Tov, because the beginning which does benefit Yom Tov. And if we don't allow them to put the door back, they won't open the doors in the first place. These are the examples. He gives 3 examples. Number 1 is oir lifnei hadosim. Why do we allow you to place the hide on the ground before the people are trampling it? Because otherwise you're not going to shech the animal. Even though there's no benefit to Yom Tov from people trampling it, but otherwise, if we don't allow you, you are not going to shech the animal because you don't want to incur a loss. But today, say chanuyas, we allow you to place these replace these doors and put them in the back, because otherwise you won't open the store in the first place. And the chazoras retiya b'migdash. We had this in the end of Masechta Eruvin, and we also had in Masechta Shabbos, that you're not allowed to put on a gauze with the cream and on Shabbos because you're smoothing out, and also it looks like medicine. But in the Beis Hamikdash we had an issue. The kohanim are not allowed to work with these band-aids on their hand because it's an interception. It's a chatzitza between their hand and the avodah. And when we had the whole story in the Gemara about the kohen who put gloves on, so you're not allowed to have a chatzitza. But when it came to a band-aid, even though generally speaking you're not allowed to put a band-aid on Shabbos, we allowed them to remove the band-aid and put it on. If they don't, they won't work in the Beis Hamikdash, and we need all the kohanim serving in the Beis Hamikdash. So we allowed chazor retiyah b'mikdash, and you're allowed to put it back on. Says the Gemara, the Chava said in the name of Rebbe Yehuda. Now Rashi has an interesting discussion here. The general rule is whenever it says Rebbe, that's Israel. Whenever it says Rav, it's Bavel. If you ever want to know this Amora, where did they live? All the Tanaim lived in Israel. But this Amora, where did he live? You look at the title. If it says Rebbe, it's Israel. And if it says Rav, it is Bavel. So now it says a Rebbe Yehuda. So who is this Rebbe Yehuda? Because Rechava was an Amora. So who is this Rebbe Yehuda? This Rebbe Yehuda, so Rashi says there's a discussion whether now Rechava lived in Bavel. So it makes sense that his teacher was Rav Yehuda. The famous Rav Yehuda was a student of Rav and then became a student of Shmuel. But it says a Rebbe Yehuda. So some want to say that maybe he heard it from Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, who was the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, of the Rebbe who wrote the Mishnayos. Rashi says he doesn't believe it for a minute. In other words, and what do you call it? And Rechava didn't know whether it's Rebbe Yehuda or Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi didn't believe for a minute because Rechava never went to Israel. He would never have heard it from Rebbe Yehuda. So therefore, and also we know that Rechava was very particular in all the names that he said. And definitely the Gemara would have included this, that he was doubting whether it was Rebbe Yehuda or Rabbi Yehuda. So Rashi concludes that even though every rabbi in Bavel is called Rav, not Rebbe, but because Rechava had one primary source for all of his learning, which was Rabbi Yehuda, he decided to call him Rebbe, and because it was his favorite. When you have one, even though you have many teachers, but you have one, like a Rabbi Muvik, a favorite, he called him Rebbe, even though he was in Bavel. Okay, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? Af haPesach Chavisa. We're talking about a case over here is an Amma Oretz. Generally, we learn more Chagiga. We'll see that an Amma Oretz generally is considered someone who's tamei. You assume they're always tamei, and if they come in contact with food, if you're a Talmid Chacham that tries to eat everything in a tahoric way, al taras hakodesh, you can no longer eat from it. But when it came to Yom Tov, we suspended that chumrah that Amoratzim are automatically tamei, because we didn't want to shame them in public and say, oh, if an Amoritz touches this, nobody can eat it in Yerushalayim, and the entire Klal Yisrael was there. So we suspended that law. What happens if a Talmid Chacham was a seller of wine, and he wants to sell his wine, or loaves of bread to people, all these tourists who are coming, or travelers are coming, guests into Yerushalayim for a Yom Tov, and everyone touches it to taste the wine, to look at the wine, touches the bread. And if an Amoritz, we suspended the rules on Amoritz. The question is, what have you opened a barrel? You sold 3/4 of it on Chalamoid, and now and the Yom Tov. Now it's after Yom Tov. What happens now? So the rules go back that an Amoritz is tamei, but the Amoritz touched it during Yom Tov. So what happens now? Do we say, well, that the laws of suspension are gone, and therefore now that we know an Amoritz touched it Chalamoid, which we surely did, therefore it becomes tamei again, or not? So we said that if somebody opened a barrel, or maschil b'yisasa, or he opened up dough and he made challah, al gava regel, even though some of it was left over after Yom Tov, we are not, Liber Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar who says, Yigmar, we allow you to continue to sell the wine as if it's tar, because otherwise nobody will open barrels, because it's a risk. I'll open a barrel, maybe I only sell half the barrel on Yom Tov, and then after Yom Tov it's tamei. I won't be able to sell to half the population. So therefore, to alleviate that risk, Rabbi Yehuda says that we are going to any barrels you open on Yom Tov, you could continue selling after Yom Tov as if it's time, unless Namaris touches it after Yom Tov. And another says the Gemara, now the Gemara will go through each one. Other than that, there's what's Ula telling us? Says clearly the Mishnah that you're allowed to place in front of it. What do you need Ula to tell me? Nay, without Ula, I could have learned Pshat in the Mishnah differently. Mountain, I would have thought, you know why you're allowed to put the oil on the ground? You can use it as a table. That's why. And even Erev Yom Tov. And the rule there would be that even if you shechted Erev Yom Tov, so you could have done whatever you want for Yom Tov, I can still put the hide Yom Tov on the ground because it's a table. Kamashwan, no. The only reason why we allow you to put the hide in the ground and people trample over it is because otherwise you're not going to shecht the Yom Tov. But if you shecht it Erev Yom Tov, then you have no right to place it on the ground because there's no special dispensation. That's number one, Ula's Chiddush. Number two, the Yom Tov in the Yom Tov only because the Yom Tov never for Yom Tov. Case number two, you're telling me that you're putting the doors back. Tanina, it says clearly in the Mishnah, you're allowed to put it back. So that people, the storekeeper, the merchant should be interested in opening up, selling it, because they know they can put it back and get for safekeeping. So you learned in the Mishnah, it says clearly, allowed to put it back. So the Gemara again, no. Without Ula, I could have learned Pshat in the Mishnah differently. I could have said, like we had before the one, the Tamayu, the Beisil, Mishum, the ain't binyan, the Kalim, the ain't state, the Kalim. There's no construction, there's no destruction when it comes to portable vessels. Therefore, I would have said that I feel about the Nam, even in your own house, your own cabinets, there's no special reason to allow you. You're allowed to take off, you're allowed to put back on, no problem. Kamashwan, that no. The only reason why we allow merchants to put it back on is because otherwise the chanuyas in only merchants we allow them because otherwise they won't open up, they won't sell anything. But the bottom line, not houses. Big machlek is Rashi places about there's no building by Kalim. According to Rashi, there's no laws of building at all by Kalim. Only if you finish a job, there might be makabeh patish or other malachas that smoothing out, but no building. Taisa says, but if you Taisa holds, that's only talking about if you repair something, putting things together. But if you build something from scratch, even if it's a keli, it's called building on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Third case, Chazara said Tibin Migdash Nami, putting back, replacing the bandage. What Tanim Roslan says, Machzina Tibin Migdash, you're allowed to put it back. Avalabin says clearly in the base of Migdash you're allowed to, but nowhere else. Says the Gemara, so what's all the adding that we didn't know before? Says the Gemara, no, I'll tell you what he's adding. I would have thought that time of you know why you're allowed to do the base of Mikdash? Because Isurin D'Rabbanan are not forbidden the base of Mikdash. Remember, more earlier we learned that most Isurin D'Rabbanan are permitted the base of Mikdash, unless it's a very severe Shavus. But most are. So I would have thought, you know why you're allowed to put the base of Mikdash? Because it's a Shavus. So D'Rabbanan were lenient. And who cares what's the reason? Because then any kohen in the base of Mikdash can put back the band-aid, not only a serving kohen. So I would have thought, time of Mamish Mikdash, there's no Rabban the Mikdash. I feel a kohen the Labar even if it's not his day of working. Mashallah, come tell you no. The reason why you're allowed to is because Tiru Seifan Meshum Chilasan. The Baravoida in, the Labar Avoida loy. Since it's a Bar Avoida, only those kohenim that are working in the base of Mikdash, we allow them, but no one else. Now comes along Rechav and adds another. So first we ask, what's the Rechava adding? Opening a barrel, we learned, if somebody opens a barrel, or he starts dough al gabe regel during Yom Tov, Rabbi Yehuda says, Yigmar, you can continue even after Yom Tov to sell as if it's tahir. And the Chacham say, Lo Yigmar, once Yom Tov is over, you can't. But Rabbi Yehuda says you can, so obviously, because otherwise you are not going to open a barrel. So no. I would have thought the reason is, Tumis Amaoretz Beregel, I would have thought that the logic of Rabbi Yehuda is simple, that Amaratzim, when it comes to Yom Tov, they're just like a Talmud Chacham. So therefore, even though Yom Tov is over now, whatever the Amar is touched during Yom Tov is all right. That's why Rabbi Yehuda says all right. And who cares? So then, then even if the barrel, let's say you open Erev Yom Tov, but no Amar has touched it, and now it comes Chalamoid and Amar touches it, maybe it's permitted because Amaratzim are considered Talmid Chachamim when it comes to Yom Tov. So the Rechava says no. The only reason why we suspend the Tumil law of Amaratzim is because otherwise you won't open the barrel. But if you already open the barrel before Yom Tov, it doesn't matter. Kamashla comes to teach you that he tiru seifim shchilasim. The only reason we allow you after Yom Tov is because we want to make sure that on Yom Tov you open up and you open barrels. He's chil'in. So only if you open it on Yom Tov or Chalamoid, but if you didn't, it doesn't help. Says the Gemara. So you're telling me this fourth, or Chava added a fourth thing. So Ula my time Amar. Why didn't Ula include this? He said three. There's four things actually that we even though the end there's no reason for it, but we did it in order to save the beginning. Says the Gemara, but Ula does not want to bring up a subject as an argument, and as you just yourself said, there's an argument Rabbi Yehuda Chachamim, so therefore you didn't want to talk about it. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? And all the dinim that you talked about is an argument of Bisham Basil. Everything here is an argument. Chanach Nami Pluktanin is an argument. Bishamai, similar answers. Now, this is the most difficult thing to understand. But Bishamai ben Mokum Hill ain't a Mishnah. I mean, it's so extraordinary. Bishamai, we learned in Gemara Erevin that Gimel there was smarter and sharper than Basil. But Basil had a roiv. And we tell Bishamai, not only is the halacha never like you, except a few exceptions, but more than that, your opinion doesn't count. Doesn't even register as an opinion. I mean, just how extraordinary. That Beishamai b'Makkah Basil ain't a Mishnah, and therefore Ula had no problem discussing laws where Shammai is the one who is the protagonist because he doesn't count. But Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, one against many, which we know that the halach is never like the one. The halach is like the many.
If he doesn't count, then how come sometimes? If he doesn't count, then how come halach is sometimes like Beit Shammai?
When we rule that, that's when it counts. Even if it doesn't count, even if it doesn't, if you remember the Gemara Shabbos, was like you remember Shabbos that Yudalid, where Shammai, and in Erevin that you Gimel there, where Shammai put a sword over there in front of the shul, and he counted and he says, "That's it, we're the majority right now, and the law is like us, and we have those 18 rules that like Shammai." Right. But even if when we say that it doesn't count, Chas shows me it doesn't count, because if you want to learn Shammai's opinion, you still have to make a Birchas HaTorah. And in fact, it says in Kabbalah that when Mashiach will come, the halacha is going to be like Shammai. Yeah. We're going to light Hanukkah candles all the way around. Sorry?
You often say the phrase Beit Shammai.
No. Very seldom. You see, we usually say, we just had today in the Gemara about, in fact, the Mefarshim want to discuss why are they even discussing Shammai's opinion of the Abaye and all that. Doesn't really matter, because generally speaking, we don't really. I don't know. The honest, I don't know. Rabbi Yehuda versus the Chachamim, definitely the halacha of the Chachamim, one against many, but that opinion is an opinion. But Shammai against Beis Hillel is not a Mishnah. I don't know. Difficult thing to understand what exactly it means and why this is so difficult. Anyway, we did have a bracha that somebody wanted to be machmer like Beis Shammai or Tarfon, and a lion almost ate him up. So you shouldn't have tried to be machmer like Beis Shammai against Beis Hillel. Anyway, the Gemara says further. Okay, Masnisin Deloika Haitana. Our Mishnah's understanding of the argument of Shammai and Hillel is very different than the following Tana. What's that? The Tana, everyone agrees. Even Shammai will agree you're allowed to remove the doors in order to encourage these people, merchants, to sell, because people needed food for Yom Tov. The argument is only once you complete it will we allow you to return those doors. Beis Shammai said, you can't put it back, because it's no longer necessary for Yom Tov. Beis Hillel says, Af Machzin, you could bring it back, because otherwise you won't do it again. Okay, that part is fine, which is different than our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, they're arguing on both sides. But now the Braisa continues. Just to understand what's going to go on here, I already could tell you the conclusion of the Gemara. But with the doors in those days, the hinges were different than ours. They had like pivots. So you had, it's called a tzir. So the doors, the proper door was, you had a piece, like a screw sticking out from the door on top, and a screw or a peg from the door on the bottom. There were holes inside the door frame on top and on the bottom, in the threshold. And you would the door would pivot right inside those holes, and you would swing back and forth. That's called a tzir. That's a permanent door. That's called tzir. Then you have a door with no tzir. You just hang on a string or something. And then you have the middle case, which I'm telling you the conclusion already, where you have this pivot only in the middle of the door, not at the sides, not at the end of the door, but in the middle you had one. So it's not as permanent as those on the side, and it swings all around. So now the Gebraisa is as follows. The Gebraisa says, when do we say this? When do they say that there's an argument? We're assuming now we're talking about those pivots there at the end of the door. So there's an argument if you want to put it back, because putting it back or taking it off is like building or destroying. There's no real peg over there. How come everyone's allowed to? Because it's not, when you put it back, it just fits in snugly and takes right out. It's not building. That's one opinion. Says the Gemara, but Tanya, but another Bryce, it says another Bryce said the whole argument is when there is no peg. There's a pegs on the end. Even Hillel said, well, that's building. How can you do that? Removing it, that's destroying. How can you do that? So how do we understand these two Bryces? They're contradicting each other. Rabbi, there's no contradiction. There's three cases here, and both Bryces are talking about different things. This is how you're supposed to learn. If there's a tzir, with the Bryce that says if there's a tzir, everyone agrees you're not allowed to. But if there's no tzir, they're arguing. Yesh lehen tzir means you have the tzir on the ends, which is permanent construction. That's forbidden. If they don't have the permanent at the end, but they have in the middle. If they have no tzir at all on the sides or the ends, because you're not building at all. You just put a door back in that hole there and you remove it. Keep pleading. The whole argument is you have this pivot right in the middle of the door. Mar Sava, one opinion is Gazrinan Tzir be'emtza oto tzir menatzad. One opinion, Beishamai says we don't allow you to put the door back, even though it's not really building, because if you have a peg and you allow him, the next time he'll, even when the peg's on the side. Mar Sava says, like Gazinan, we're not going to make that gzera, it's too far-fetched, and we allow. That's how we learn. And therefore, the two Bryces, when they talk